So, this paradigm shift, and I won't dwell on this because you all know this is part of your life. There are huge changes taking place in the relationship between corporates and NGOs and between the larger funding sector, both private and institutional, and NGOs and other players in this space. We're talking about a much stronger scrutiny of outcomes and purpose and objectives, which is good, but we're also talking about a change in who sets the agenda. We're talking about measured incomes. We are perhaps creating contracts where we want to see governance and we want to see accountability. But encouragingly too, there's a huge source for new energy and new purpose and new ways of doing things that will have a multiplier effect far faster. In the process, the role of NGOs in many of these development partnerships is changing. And though often the word used is partner, in many instances, the relationship is one of service provider, that the terms and conditions of what is to be done have been set, and in effect, the NGOs are being asked to sign on the bottom line. This is a reality. You can rail against it, but it's happening. The question is, how do you adapt to it? How do you develop a sustainable framework for it? And how do you, in fact, profit from it? Part of the frustration and part of the sense of we're not getting anywhere, I think, is that we're trying to do everything all at once. And we're not being specific enough because the challenges seem so overwhelming about actually identifying what we are doing. By simple force of ugly reality, I think many NGOs have been sucked into the first category of simply plugging more of the gaps. And that's a real and cruel dilemma when you live in and work in a situation of overwhelming poverty and you can only do a little bit. How do you stop yourself being drawn into trying to protect and secure? Are we talking about replication? There were some interesting comments about replication because it's brilliant to have the example, but who wants to fund second and third? That's often a challenge. Are we talking about working to scale? It's going to cost more. Are we talking about building together, or are we talking about buying services? Are we talking about quick wins or lasting change? And whatever it is we're talking about, what tools are we using to drive the change, in addition to the strategy? And I often think that in some of the efforts that we undertake to fight poverty, it's rather like using tin openers to try and take on a battleship. You can send as many people armed with tin openers into the fight as you want. You're not going to make a dent on the battleship. And I think we need to recognize the capacities and the resources that we need to mobilize. There's a lot of talk about impact, and impact, of course, is significant. We can't be pedaling bicycles without chains and getting nowhere. But I was very struck this year, of course, you all know, is the centenary of the Titanic, and like many of you, I went to go and see that movie. And I was struck by this extraordinary story of this big, bold investment, planned to the last detail. The Titanic was the biggest ship afloat. Fortune had been spent on it. The world's best engineers had labored over it. It was going to change the whole industry, and it was going to make the world sit up. And boy, it did make the world sit up, and we're still talking about the Titanic today. But I don't think that's the kind of impact it hoped for. And it got me thinking about another example of impact, and I thought of Noah and his ark. Firstly, it occurred to me what a remarkable piece of crisis management this was. But also, perhaps when we talk about impact, we need to be asking the question, not firstly, how many and counting, but as Nicola reminded us, how. That performance management. We can set ourselves as many targets and as many goals as we want. But again, with our tin openers in our hands, we're never going to reach them. And we've got to scale and plan. And I think that's where the Noah's Ark example of impact is extraordinarily powerful. We are not going to find one big, bold solution. We need to take everybody with us. And when we reach our destination, set them free to follow their paths, taking the example of biodiversity. And I think Noah's Ark, in its simple, homespun kind of a way, presents us with some really important lessons about long-term impact that perhaps the planners of the Titanic might have reflected upon.